New York City, 1998. My high school friends have begun to suspect I haven't told them the full story of my life. Why did you leave Sierra Leone? Because there is a war. Did you witness some of the fighting? Everyone in the country did. You mean you saw people running around with guns and shooting each other? Yes, all the time. Cool. I smile a little. You should tell us about it sometime. Yes, sometime. There were all kinds of stories told about the war that made it sound as if it was happening in a faraway and different land. It wasn't until refugees started passing through our town that we began to see that it was actually taking place in our country. Families who had walked hundreds of miles told how relatives had been killed and their houses burned. Some people felt sorry for them and offered them places to stay, but most of the refugees refused because they said the war would eventually reach our town. The children of these families wouldn't look at us, and they jumped at the sound of chopping wood or as stones landed on the tin roofs flung by children hunting birds with slingshots. The adults among these children from the war zones would be lost in their thoughts during conversation with the elders of my town. Apart from their fatigue and malnourishment, it was evident they had seen something that plagued their minds, something that we would refuse to accept if they told us all of it. At times, I thought that some of the stories the passerbyers told were exaggerated. The only wars I knew of were those that I had read about in books or seen in movies such as Rambo First Blood, and the one in neighboring Liberia that I had heard about on the BBC News. My imagination at 10 years old didn't have the capacity to grasp what had taken away the happiness of the refugees. According to the teachers, the rebels had attacked the mining areas in the afternoon. The sudden outburst of gunfire had caused people to run for their lives in different directions. Fathers had come running from their workplaces only to stand in front of their empty houses with no indication of where their families had gone. Mothers wept as they ran toward schools, rivers, and water taps to look for their children. Children ran home to look for parents who were wandering the streets in search of them. And as the gunfire intensified, people gave up looking for their loved ones and ran out of town. This town will be next, according to the teachers. Gabrilla lifted himself from the cement floor. Junior, Taloy, and I took our backpacks and headed to the wharf with our friends. There, people were arriving from all over the mining area. Some we knew, but they couldn't tell us the whereabouts of our families. They said the attack had been too sudden, too chaotic, that everyone had fled in different directions in total confusion. You were negative 19 years old. That's what my father used to say when I would ask about what life was like in Sierra Leone following independence in 1961. It had been a British colony since 1808. Sir Milton Margai became the first prime minister and ruled the country under the Sierra Leone People's Party political banner until his death in 1964. His half brother, Sir Albert Margai, succeeded him until 1967 when Siaka Stevens, the All People's Congress Party leader, won the election, which was followed by a military coup. Siaka Stevens returned to power in 1968 and several years later declared the country a one-party state, the APC being the sole legal party. It was the beginning of rotten politics, as my father would put it. I wondered what he would say about the war that I was now running from. I had heard from adults that this was a revolutionary war, a liberation of the people from a corrupt government. But what kind of liberation movement shoots innocent civilians, children, that little girl? There wasn't anyone to answer these questions, and my head felt heavy with the images that it contained. As we walked, I became afraid of the road, the mountains in the distance, and the bushes on either side. There was a thick forest on one side of the village where my grandmother lived, and coffee farms on the other. A river flowed from the forest to the edge of the village, passing through palm kernels into a swamp. Above the swamp, banana farms stretched into the horizon. The main dirt road that passed through Kabati was rutted with holes and puddles where ducks liked to bathe during the day. And in the backyards of the houses, birds nested in mango trees. We must strive to be like the moon. An old man in Kabati repeated the sentence often to people who walked past his house on their way to the river to fetch water, hunt, to tap palm wine, and to their farms. I remember asking my grandmother what the old man meant, and she explained that the adage served to remind people to always be on their best behavior and to be good to others. She said that people complain when there is too much sun and it gets unbearably hot, and also when when it rains too much or when it's cold. But she said no one grumbles when the moon shines. Everyone becomes happy and appreciates the moon in their own special way. Children watch their shadows and play in its light. People gather at the square to tell stories and dance through the night. A lot of happy things happen when the moon shines. These are some of the reasons why we should want to be like the moon. That night, for the first time in my life, I realized that it is the physical presence of people and their spirits that gives a town life. With the absence of so many people, the town became scary, the night darker, and the silence unbearably agitating. Normally, the crickets and birds sang in the evening before the sun went down, but this time they didn't. The darkness set in very fast. The moon wasn't in the sky. The air was stiff, as if nature itself was afraid of what was happening. After we crossed the swamp, the real trouble started because the rebels began shooting their guns at people instead of shooting into the sky. They didn't want people to abandon the town because they needed to use civilians as a shield against the military. One of the main aims of the rebels when they took over a town was to force the civilians to stay with them, especially women and children. This way, they could stay longer as military intervention would be delayed. We were now at the top of a bushy hill immediately behind the swamp in a clearing just before the escape route. Seeing the civilians all about to make it out, the rebels fired rocket-propelled grenades, machine guns, AK-47s, G3s, all the weapons they had directly into the clearing. But we knew we had no choice. We had to make it across the clearing because as young boys, the risk of staying in town was greater for us than trying to escape. Young boys were immediately recruited, and the initials RUF were carved wherever it pleased the rebels with a hot bayonet. This not only meant that you were scarred for life, but that you could never escape from them, because escaping with the carving of the rebels' initials was asking for death, as soldiers would kill you without any question, and militant civilians would do the same. That night, we were temporarily happy that we had some money and were hoping to buy some cooked rice with cassava or potato leaves for dinner. We high-fived each other as we approached the village market, and our stomachs growled as the smell of palm oil wafted from cooking huts. But when we got back to the cooked food stalls, we were disappointed to find that those who had been selling cassava leaves, okra soup, and potato leaves, all cooked with dried fish and rich palm oil served with rice, had ceased to do so. Some of them were saving their food in case things got worse, and others simply didn't want to sell anymore for unexplained reasons. After all the trouble and risk we undertook to get the money, it became useless. We would have been less hungry if we had stayed at the village instead of walking the miles to Matrujang and back. I wanted to blame someone for this particular predicament, but there was no one to be blamed. We had made a logical decision, and it had come to this. It was a typical aspect of being in the war. Things changed rapidly in a matter of seconds, and no one had any control over anything. We had yet to learn these things and implement survival tactics, which was what it came down to. That night, we were so hungry that we stole people's food while they slept. It was the only way to get through the night. Head stood out at his fierce red eyes, watching the trembling face of the old man, whose eyelids were shaking uncontrollably. Before the war, a young man wouldn't have dared to talk to anyone older in such a rude manner. We grew up in a culture that demanded good behavior from everyone, and especially from the young. Young people were required to respect their elders and everyone in the community. I left town to look for my family, the old man said in a frightened voice as he managed to catch his breath. The rebel with the semi-automatic machine gun, who had been standing against a tree smoking a cigarette, furiously walked toward the old man and pointed his gun between the old man's legs. You left Matrujang because you don't like us. He put his gun on the old man's forehead and continued. You left because you are against our cause as freedom fighters, right? The old man closed his eyes tightly and began to sob. What cause? I thought. I used the only freedom that I had then, my thought. They couldn't see it. While the interrogation went on, one of the rebels painted RUF on all the walls of the houses in the village. He, in a group of 6 boys, was not to our advantage, but we had to stay together because we had a better chance of escaping. The people were terrified of boys our age. They'd heard rumors about young boys being forced by rebels to kill their families and burn their villages. The children now patrolled in special units, killing and maiming civilians. There were those who had been victims of these terrors and carried fresh scars to show for it. So whenever people saw us, we reminded them of the massacres, and that struck fear in their hearts again. Some people tried to hurt us to protect themselves, their families, and communities. Because of these things, we decided to bypass villages by walking through the nearby bushes. This way, we would be safe and avoid causing chaos. This was one of the consequences of the Civil War. People stopped trusting each other, and every stranger became an enemy. Even people who knew you became extremely careful about how they related or spoke to you. I walked for 2 days straight without sleeping. I stopped only at streams to drink water. I felt as if somebody was after me. Often my shadow would scare me and cause me to run for miles. Everything felt awkwardly brutal. Even the air seemed to want to attack me and break my neck. I knew I was hungry, but I didn't have the appetite to eat or the strength to find food. I had passed through burnt villages where dead bodies of men, women, and children of all ages were scattered like leaves on the ground after a storm. Their eyes still showed fear, as if death hadn't freed them from the madness that continued to unfold. I had seen heads cut off by machetes, smashed by cement bricks, and rivers filled with so much blood that the water had ceased flowing. Each time my mind replayed these scenes, I increased my pace. Sometimes I closed my eyes hard to avoid thinking, but the eye of my mind refused to be closed and continued to plague me with images. My body twitched with fear. I became dizzy. I could see the leaves on those trees swaying, but I couldn't feel the wind. The most difficult part of being in the forest was the loneliness. It became unbearable each day. One thing about being lonesome is that you think too much, especially when there isn't much else you can do. I didn't like this, and I tried to stop myself from thinking, but nothing seemed to work. I decided to just ignore every thought that came to my head because it brought too much sadness. Apart from eating and drinking water, and once every other day taking a bath, I spent most of my time fighting myself mentally in order to avoid thinking about what I'd seen or wondering where my life was going, where my family and friends were. The more I resisted thinking, the longer the days became, and I felt as if my head was becoming heavier each passing day. I became restless and was afraid to sleep for fear that my suppressed thoughts would appear in my dreams. When I was very little, my father used to say, "If you're alive, there is hope for a better day and something good to happen. If there is nothing good left in the destiny of a person, he or she will die." I have thought about these words during my journey, and they kept me moving when I didn't know where I was going. Those words became the vehicle that drove my spirit forward and made it stay alive. It was the Atlantic Ocean. The sounds we had heard were those of the waves hitting the shore. I had seen parts of the ocean, but had never stood at the shore of one this vast. It spread out beyond the vision of my eyes. The sky was at its bluest and seemed to curve down and join with the ocean in the distance. My eyes widened, a smile formed on my face. Even in the middle of the madness, there remained that true and natural beauty, and it took my mind away from my current situation as I marveled at this sight. In truth, realizing that I would eventually be caught, I stopped running and offered my hands to be tied. The man chasing me was a little taken aback. He approached me with caution and motioned another man walking beside me with a stick and a machete to pay attention. As the man tied my hands, we exchanged a glance that lasted a few seconds. I opened my eyes wide, trying to tell him that I was just a 12-year-old boy, but something in his eyes told me that he didn't care for my safety, but only for his and his village's. The men walked us to their village and made us sit outside in the sand in front of their chief. I had been through this before and wondered if it was a new experience for my present traveling companions. They were all heaving as they tried to hold back their cries. I began to worry because last time I had found someone in the village who had gone to school with us and saved us. This time we were a long way from Matrujang, a long way gone.